I'm Roy Lee Lindsay with the North Carolina Pork Council, and I want everyone to remember bacon makes everything better.
Mike Waddell and David Glenn back with you here on the North Carolina Sports Network. And DG, under a bill filed earlier this month in the North Carolina House of Representatives, UNC and NC State would be required to play regular rotations of games against three other in-state universities: Appalachian State, Charlotte, and East Carolina, in three specific sports. That's football, men's basketball, and women's basketball. My first question to you, David, is what's the number one thing that sports fans here in the Old North State should remember as this bill is being considered by members of the North Carolina General Assembly?
Yeah, Mike, it's always great to be with you, and this is an intriguing development. I think my starting point would be to remind everybody that a very large majority of bills that are proposed by our state legislators never even come to a vote, much less become actual legislation. So that's kind of the 60,000 feet view for starters. Beyond that, I would remind people that modern American politics have become, in part, about performance art. That's just the reality, right? These folks want their constituents and potential future voters to be able to think or see, whether there's substance behind it or not, whether something has a chance of becoming law or not. They, as politicians, look for these no-brainer type issues where they probably won't alienate anybody with these kinds of proposals, but they might get some of their constituents to say, this guy's fighting for my school at App State, or my school at ECU, or my school at UNC Charlotte. So it doesn't surprise me at all when I looked into the details of this that there are four primary sponsors of this bill, which, to be clear, would require UNC and NC State to play at least one of ECU, App State, and Charlotte every year, and would require both the Tar Heels and the Wolfpack to play each of those schools home and away at least every 6 years. So there's multiple layers to it. But the primary bill sponsors, at the beginning, there were four. Guess what? One is a graduate of Appalachian State, two are graduates of UNC Charlotte, and the fourth describes himself as a huge fan of the Appalachian State Mountaineers. So I'm not suggesting that this is not a worthy debate or an invalid topic, but I am definitely suggesting that part of this is performance art, and there is only so much of a chance that it ever comes to a real vote. And I would argue not a great chance that it ever becomes the law of North Carolina, although we certainly can't shut the door to that possibility right now here in May.
David, there are lots of stories and maybe some myths, urban legends from back in the 1990s when some North Carolina lawmakers wanted UNC and NC State to play East Carolina in football more often. You've been on this story for over 3 decades. Did the North Carolina legislature actually adopt laws that required those teams to play back in the day?
I'm glad you asked that, Mike, because that is definitely myth. That is definitely urban legend. I could probably write a book about this. But I will say that there is something to political influence when it comes to how that happened. And remember, ECU was not a big brand name in football for most of the 20th century. And then the Pirates started to gain some traction as a regionally intriguing program in the 80s and in the 90s. And sure enough, in the early 90s, there were politicians, legislators among them, who in the eastern part of North Carolina felt like, and justifiably so, that sometimes that part of the state got neglected. Sometimes the schools in that part of the state got neglected, whereas UNC got what it wanted most of the time. NC State got what it wanted most of the time. Of course, most people know these are all public universities in our state. So if you're advocating for ECU or any other public university, you just want to be treated fairly. So the answer to, was there a law requiring UNC and NC State to start playing this up-and-coming ECU football program? Answer, no. Was there an actual vote by the North Carolina legislature on such a proposal? Answer, no. But what is true, and people can decide for themselves how much this political influence made it happen, that sure enough, guess what? The Tar Heels and the Pirates have played a whole lot in the 21st century after not playing too often prior to that. And quick numbers, NC State has played ECU, for example, 10 times in the last 20 years, so half the time. UNC has played ECU 10 times in the last 23 years, or right around the turn of the century, so almost half the time. Would that have happened? Those frequencies of the rivalries between Wolfpack Pirates, Tar Heels Pirates, would that have happened that frequently were it not for some political influence in the early and mid 1990s? It's hard to give a firm answer on that. But for example, there was an influential politician, a Democrat named Ed Warren in Pitt County, North Carolina, who was advocating for ECU. And he communicated with the chancellor at NC State at the time, Larry Monteith, the athletic director at NC State at the time, Todd Turner. He also communicated with the AD at Carolina at the time, John Swafford, and the chancellor at Carolina at the time, Paul Hardin. Sure enough, after those conversations, again, not legislation, not you're required by law to play each other, but after those conversations from Ed Warren and other influential people in Eastern North Carolina, guess what? The Tar Heels and the Wolfpack both started putting the Pirates on the schedule in football pretty regularly. So this 2024 discussion that we're having involves three sports: football, men's basketball, women's basketball, as you outlined earlier, Mike. Back in the 90s, it was really about football. And again, it wasn't legislation that made it happen as a matter of law, but you could argue that certainly the political football of those rivalries and the political debate and influence behind the discussion about how often those teams should play, it's certainly, you can't argue with the end result. They've played each other fairly often here in the 21st century, and we'd have been left to speculate whether that would have happened had there not been those political conversations back in the early and mid-90s behind the scenes.
David, I've worked in college athletics for over 38 years, off and on. I've been in the ACC, the Big Ten, the SEC. And in this day and age of conference realignment, there's a lot of things that are changing right now. Texas, for instance, doesn't play Texas Tech. There's rumors that Oklahoma State and Oklahoma might not play anymore, that Bedlam could go away. When you look at the future of college athletics, there's going to be a lot of this, but are you aware of any laws in any state that get into the actual scheduling of games between in-state schools?
I saw a glimpse of your late great father in that question, Michael Waddell. Mike's dad was an attorney. You asked that question like an attorney, and I appreciate that. You asked, am I aware of any law requiring teams to play each other? Especially, of course, these are public universities in other states that you just referred to. I'm going to answer like a lawyer by saying I am not aware of any present or former laws like the ones that's proposed to be a law here in North Carolina as we're having this discussion. I am not aware of any today or in prior decades. However, those examples you gave absolutely have started political conversations. Specifically, the most recent examples I can think of in my 38 years of covering college sports, the only two real recent examples I can think of were in Oklahoma and in the state of Texas. Because remember, for example, the Texas Longhorns and the Texas A&M Aggies were members of the same conference for a long, long time. And then Texas A&M, remember, left for the SEC. Well, now, as it turns out now, Texas is also headed to the SEC starting this summer. But in the interim, there were Texas state legislators who proposed, it did not become law, but they did run it up the flagpole for legislative consideration. Should we mandate Texas A&M, large public university, playing Texas, large public university? And you can throw in the other public universities there, including Texas Tech that you mentioned. Because they're public universities, in our state, of course, Wake Forest and Duke as private universities are not governed by, directly or indirectly, the North Carolina legislature. Well, UNC and NC State, among other public universities here in North Carolina, they are influenced by the legislature, and sometimes they're told what to do. They're certainly told what their budgets are allowed to be, right? So that's a pretty important connection that a legislature in any state would have to its public universities that you simply do not have the same kind of power and control over private universities. So those public universities in Texas, there was a debate in that legislature. Should we adopt a law requiring the Longhorns and the Aggies to play each other in football? It never became law. The other example was also a good one. Oklahoma and Oklahoma State have been fellow members of the Big 12 for the entire existence of the Big 12. And they were fellow members of other same conferences prior to that. Well, guess what? This summer, the Oklahoma Sooners are headed to the SEC. That means the Bedlam rivalry, Oklahoma against Oklahoma State, is no more unless they choose to play each other as non-conference opponents. Sure enough, again, there's some performance art involved here. All these folks love to show their constituents, we're going to bat for what you want, but it usually ends up being a lot more about the appearance of things, the performance art, if you will, which are all over American politics to a ridiculous degree at this stage. Politicians will now lie to you, performance art style, in the hopes that you just don't know they're lying to you or what they're misrepresenting. It's all, of course, in pursuit of your vote and a perception that these politicians are trying to have. Neither in the Oklahoma case or the Texas case did these football debates rise to the level of those laws being adopted. So to this moment, it's left to those schools and their athletic directors and anyone else who has influence on scheduling. It's left to them how often they want to play each other in football or any other sport, or whether they just want to let a long-standing rivalry either be reduced or fall by the wayside entirely. We don't know how those things are going to shake out, but we do know that those two examples did not result in new state laws. And I honestly am not aware of any such laws in the history of college athletics. They may be somewhere there in the archives. I've never written about them. I've never seen them. And until further notice, I'm not aware that any have existed or do exist right now, even as our state is not necessarily contemplating this legislation. It's not that far along yet, but at least that House bill has been proposed that would require the Wolfpack and the Tar Heels to play under certain parameters, those three other in-state public universities, all of which, remember, play FBS level football. App State, ECU, and Charlotte are the other three public universities in North Carolina that play top-level college football. So that's one of the reasons that these legislators are going to bat for those programs. They want to protect those three and enhance those three and maybe reward the fans with more of these in-state rivalry games. If they do that, of course, they would be directly taking away from the scheduling autonomy that UNC and NC State and all of these schools have enjoyed for the entire existence in every sport of their athletic programs on campus. Michael Berard, Managing Director Investments with the Founders Group at Stifel, works with a select group of high net worth individuals and institutions to develop and implement investment plans tailored to their specific objectives and risk tolerances. If you are interested in highly personalized, well-researched guidance and outstanding personal service, you can contact Michael at 984-364-2002. That's 984-364-2002. Stifel Nicholas and Company Incorporated, member SIPC and NYSE.
If you're Bubba Cunningham at North Carolina or Boo Corrigan over in Raleigh at NC State, what are you thinking when you hear politicians again in the state of North Carolina involving themselves in sports things as opposed to, regular politician things?
Well, number one, I'd say, hey, it's been a certain way for 100 years. Are we really doing such a bad job that the North Carolina legislature has to tell us how to schedule football and basketball games? And oh, by the way, another thing I would say if I were Bubba Cunningham at UNC or Boo Corrigan at NC State is we're already playing these schools. I gave you those numbers about how often the Tar Heels have played the Pirates, 10 times in the last 23 years. How often have the Wolfpack played the Pirates? 10 times in the last 20 years. Carolina just finished. I think they've played App State, the Tar Heels, 3 times in the last 5 years, right? I know that NC State, as we speak, Mike, already has home football games already scheduled, already on the books for the future against App State and ECU and the Charlotte 49ers. So I would argue in part, you are legislators searching for a solution to a problem that doesn't currently exist. We're already playing these schools, at least to some degree. Our track record looking back shows that we've been willing to play these schools. Remember, Charlotte hasn't even been an FBS program, but for a decade or so, Tar Heels just played the Mountaineers. The Pirates have had regularly scheduled games against both the Wolfpack and the Tar Heels. But I would also remind the legislators, Mike, something that they might not think of. If you're carving into UNC's autonomy or NC State's autonomy, the good points that the legislators are making are, hey, a lot of fans love these rivalry games. Absolutely a fair point. You save on travel costs when you play in-state opponents. Absolutely another fair point, right? You can drive to Greenville and back, Boone and back, Charlotte and back, if you're the Wolfpack or the Tar Heels. You can even avoid hotel stays and other extreme expenses, like in the new ACC, flying all the way to Cal or Stanford out on the West Coast or SMU in Texas. It takes a lot of money to transport 100 football players when you count some walk-ons or whatever the traveling number typically is in an 85 scholarship sport, plus support staff and coaches, et cetera. That costs a lot of money. So some fair points about the wisdom of ramping up intra-state rivalries like the ones involved in this House bill proposal. But what I'd say if I'm Bubba Cunningham or Boo Corrigan is those games don't make us extra money at State or at UNC. If the Tar Heels or the Wolfpack, Mike, and you know this as a longtime athletic director, if they choose to play, let's say, an SEC opponent in Bank of America Stadium in Charlotte, they're being paid millions of dollars for that made-for-TV game. Remember, those games are on top of the conference TV money that they get through the ACC's partnership with ESPN and ABC, right? Those league games are already sort of part of the revenue that's pouring into the ACC. When you add, let's say the Tar Heels played the South Carolina Gamecocks here recently in that Duke's Mayo Classic, they call it. There's the Duke's Mayo Bowl. That's different. This was a regular season game that the Gamecocks and the Tar Heels played. You're not making millions of dollars from a TV partner because you play ECU or App State or Charlotte. In fact, historically, in-state football games attract lousy TV audiences. there are exceptions to that. When the Tar Heels and the Wolfpack play head-to-head, they get millions of viewers. Occasionally, when the Wolfpack or the Tar Heels plays ECU, they'll get a couple million viewers. But more often, when State or Carolina plays one of these other in-state schools, it's well below 1 million TV viewers, which by the standards of college football is a lousy TV audience. So again, if you carve into the Wolfpack or the Tar Heels autonomy when it comes to the scheduling, you're costing them money. Even if you might be helping them fill their stadiums by selling some tickets, it doesn't help on the TV side, and it certainly doesn't help with that made-for-TV payday that I described with those specialty games, not only in Charlotte, but sometimes Atlanta and elsewhere. I would also remind the state legislators that my job as an athletic director, if I'm Boo Corrigan or Bubba Cunningham, my hands are already tied for 8 of my 12 regular season games. I get 8 assigned games from the league office. I don't have 12 games of flexibility every year. I have 4 games of flexibility every year. And my coaches are telling me they want me to schedule a certain way. And my fans and season ticket holders and boosters are telling me they want me to schedule a different way. Some fans want those intersectional matchups against SEC teams and Big Ten teams. Some coaches want those major conference opponents on their schedule more often. Others want them less often. A lot of coaches want at least one FCS level opponent on their schedule. So if you're an athletic director and your conference office gives you 8 games, and maybe your coach asks you to sign up an FCS opponent every year, well, now you're at 9 out of 12. That means you only have flexibility for 3 games every year. And now the state of North Carolina's legislature wants to tell me how I got to handle some of those 3 games of flexibility that I have every year. I would also add, Mike, as this conversation unfolds, oh, by the way, it costs schools money most of the time to get out of contracts that are already signed. So, for example, UNC's next football game scheduling opening for Carolina is 2029. That means that if the state of North Carolina imposed this legislation immediately, Carolina would have to cancel games with some non-conference opponents just to be able to squeeze in new games against App State and Charlotte and ECU to meet the standards of this new legislation. Well, guess what? It costs a lot of money to cancel contracts for games that you've already scheduled for 2024, 2025, all the way through 2029. NC State has 1 or 2 openings between now and 2029, but I'm not sure these legislators are savvy enough to realize schedules are set often years in advance. And those football examples show it. With 1 or 2 exceptions, the Heels and the Wolfpack already have full schedules until 2029. Now, you could rewrite the legislation to give them a little grandfather clause that maybe it only kicks in as of whatever, because I don't think these North Carolina legislatures want Carolina and State paying a lot of money to cancel scheduling contracts that are already in place, especially in football. Oh, by the way, the conference office also gives you 20 men's basketball games. I mean, you only play 26 to 30 regular season games in men's basketball. And again, the conference office is handing me 20 of those. So I only have flexibility as I make my men's basketball schedule with 6 to 10 games a year. And remember, some of those 6 to 10 games are on the road. So it's even a smaller number when it comes to the home non-conference games. It's just not as easy as people think. And oh, by the way, State and Carolina are already mixing in all 3 of those schools. So maybe it is, the solution in search of a problem that I mentioned earlier. But those are the things, among others, that I would say if I'm asked about this legislation and I'm in the shoes of Bubba Cunningham at UNC, Boo Corrigan at NC State, or any other AD that is in their shoes in future years. In sports, we talk a lot about impact players who make a positive difference. When it comes to our state's economy, the North Carolina pork industry is a true MVP. Each year, the pork industry plays an important role in supporting rural communities across our state. It contributes more than $10 billion a year to the North Carolina economy and supports more than 44,000 jobs. Learn more about their positive impact at ncpork.org. The North Carolina Pork Council, the foundational partner of the North Carolina Sports Network.
I've dealt as an athletic director with legislators and mayors and everybody, and it's all like they go to a Holiday Inn Express somewhere and they get an idea. And oh, wow, this would be really great. But like you said, football schedules are now being made 7 to 10 years in advance, and that's under the current conference structure. If North Carolina or NC State would go to a new conference, the Big 12, the Big 10, the SEC, you could have more conference games. It could be a 10-game conference schedule. On the basketball side, how many times have we talked about the net rating? No offense, but if North Carolina and NC State all of a sudden have to play Appalachian State, Charlotte, and East Carolina, well, that's just going to take games away from North Carolina Central, North Carolina A&T, and the bevy of other in-state Division I schools that get those games right now. So you're really picking your poison here. And it hits a tough nerve to me specifically, David, because as you said, I've been an athletic director, I've been a deputy AD, I've been around, and these scheduling things are really tough. There's a guy who used to be an ESPN executive named Dave Brown who runs more or less college football scheduling for everybody. He has this chrysalis of a website to where you go in and see everybody's schedule and every year coming up and how much they're getting paid and this and that. About the travel, you're not saving any money on travel because I guarantee you that Dave Dorn and Matt Brown, if they're playing an away game at App State, Charlotte, or East Carolina, are not hopping on their customized Trailways bus and huffing it down there the day of the game. They're going the day before. Same for Hubert Davis and Kevin Keats. They travel a day before. They travel in style. They want to get there, get acclimated. This is not high school sports. Do the sponsors of this bill have the votes in Raleigh to get this passed into law?
Probably not. And I will give the sponsors credit for this. They did enough research that they realized that if they didn't give a 6-year window to play each of those 3 other schools home and away, that it would be too burdensome. So that they at least did some minimal research. And of course, parts of what they're proposing, including, by the way, State and Carolina having to play each other every year. Obviously, if State and Carolina at some point down the road end up members of different conferences, that's another topic for another day. But, you could get the legislatures involved at that point. But right now, they're both members of the ACC, so that's not really an issue. The reason I don't think they would have the votes if it came to this is just as these men advocate for App State and Charlotte and ECU, I mentioned all 4 primary sponsors are either affiliated with or graduates of or root for either Charlotte or App State in all 4 cases. That's not a surprise that they're going down that road because that's their team. Guess what? State and Carolina also have a lot of North Carolina legislators who are willing to go to bat for them. And if they get enough feedback from State and Carolina that this is not what they want, they don't want to lose their scheduling autonomy. They don't want the state of North Carolina legislature to tell them what to do when it comes to these issues that, again, they've been allowed to handle themselves without governmental intrusion for 100 years now. If there's enough pushback, well, then probably enough North Carolina legislators will vote the way the Tar Heels and the Wolfpack would want them to vote, just as others would vote the way that ECU or App State or Charlotte want them to vote. In the end, this might never come to a vote, but even if it did, I would be surprised if it passed.